in sensing, imaging, and timing. So as Ivan's already mentioned, so my role is that I'm head of business and technology within the UK National Quantum Technology Programme. I specifically specialize in imaging and sensing, and now timing as of last Christmas. And really my role comprises of bringing together business and people and finances to develop the UK landscape in quantum. I also do a fair number of delegations on kind of a global level. So I've recently just come back from Japan, going back out actually again in a few weeks' time. So that's been exciting. I know a number of you from Japanese-based companies online today. So I look forward to speaking to your colleagues there. And if there's anyone that you would like me to meet out there, then please do say so after the call. But broadly speaking, I think it would be great to talk about where this area is going at the moment. And I suppose just to start off from the UK's perspective, quantum is still a small sector in the grand scheme of things, but it only started really in 2014. And it's amazing what we've been able to sort of progress forward in terms of how much we can market and the areas that we can assess here. I always made the joke of everything can be commercialized nowadays. We even have a space sector, so we can commercialize space itself. But nonetheless, let's sort of dive into some contextual numbers. At the moment, broadly speaking, there's clearly an error bar, quite a significant error bar in this. The UK photonic landscape is valued at about 20 billion per annum in terms of its impact to the UK economy. And we see around about a 2 billion valuation in quantum on that. So the main sort of takeaway from this is that the UK, that ratio is very, very high, that sort of 10-to-1 ratio. And I mean that high in a context of the global ratio. So we see other economies, the main one to sort of point out is the US. It's far closer to that sort of 100-to-1 basis. It's important also to recognize that different countries have strengths and weaknesses in certain areas. The US is far more involved from a semiconductor basis than the UK is, for example, and there are different areas in quantum that the US focuses on. So timing, for example, and the UK is pretty strong when it comes to sensing and imaging, particularly imaging has a historic context within the UK. In fact, the last data that I had hands
Vou tentar
on
desligar isto, não consigo.
was back in 2023, and Europe actually had the biggest investment in the quantum market in sensing and imaging. So pretty darn strong there. The other thing, just to give sort of some context for this talk, is where the industry is going at the moment, again, relative to photonics. So in photonics, we largely see a pretty strong revenue stream at the moment. The unusual factor is a bit of a stagnation in terms of jobs. So not that many new jobs coming in, but per job, they're making more money. We see a lot of M&A, so merger and acquisitions happening at the moment as well. And that is particularly dominant in the quantum market. That's not massively surprising, quantum being a sort of a new area, but we see somewhat the same. The job growth is slightly more in quantum, but only slightly. So again, we're seeing more of the few people who are involved are generating more income. So most businesses are focusing on their sort of value add per product is generally the trend that we're seeing. And then one of the biggest factors at the moment in the world is the back and forth with AI. So in terms of startups for 2025, by far and away, the most was in AI. In the UK alone, I believe there was about 250 AI startups officially registered in the UK, compared to about 25 in quantum. So effectively a tenfold increase, relatively speaking. And then a lot of the other sectors are somewhere in between there. But again, AI to outcompete even areas like life sciences, where startups are historically very strong, is pretty impressive. So no doubt a lot of the trends that we're going to see in quantum will be influenced by AI. And that might be in terms of power management, data management, giving additional axes for those matrices to look under. It's all going to be very, very important. To give a more concrete example, in imaging, for example, the use of LiDAR with quantum sensors is seen as a key thing for AI. It gives another dimension effectively to do their algorithmic approaches on. And then in the sort of the longer term, we're expecting there to be, well, relative stability in the immediate future, but a bit more volatility in the market. And this is mostly going to come about that a lot of quantum initiatives are government funded at the moment. And that's not going to disappear tomorrow. But sooner or later, governments are going to want their return on investment, certainly from the UK's perspective. We've been running our national programme for 11 years now. So we've been in this job for a little while. And you can understand why taxpayers want to see what they're going to get for their money. Not to say that they haven't been getting their return on investment in the meantime, but people are going to be looking for some more concrete examples. Now, this won't solely rely on imaging and sensing. Quantum compute is clearly the headline on a global level, but certainly there'll be some expectations to have more and more products in this area. And you'll see some of that influence in some of the points that I talk about later on. So that's kind of where we are from an economic standpoint. From a product standpoint, in the quantum domain, I'm going to pick three sort of examples. So on the top, just talking about from a sort of detector standpoint, specifically, I'll talk about SPAD detectors. The image, by the way, is from the James Watt telescope, if anyone's particularly interested in that. But in SPADs in general, we're mostly seeing a pretty fierce competition on the patenting landscape. So a lot of people are building up their patent portfolio in SPADs. We know that Canon, for example, has been pretty progressive with this. Sony is sort of working their way through a lot of applications that they can patent through. And the interaction between industry and academia is heavily on the, what do you have in terms of your IP, in terms of your patent portfolio at the moment. In particular, there's certainly a hunt for time-correlated single photon counting. This is mostly because a lot of the products on the market at the moment are time-gated. And largely, customers are looking for this because they want that performance metric, mostly in the time domain when they're doing LiDAR. They want to do high-resolution LiDAR. So that's really a push at the moment. There is a bit of an interplay there because some people are coming up with approaches where they say, actually, time-gated is okay for the majority of the mainstream markets, such as automotive. But we've seen a bit of back and forth on that sort of front. So I'm expecting that there's going to be a few time-correlated single photon counting detectors coming out in the next couple of months and years. And that kind of patent landscape will continue to be pretty fierce. The other thing to mention, just like in quantum compute, the conventional technology holds on strong, and your good old-fashioned CMOS detectors are still very, very good and continue to be developed. So one thought may be that conventional CMOS will actually hold out for a lot longer than expected. But sooner or later, these large semiconductor firms are going to have to pivot or understand the architecture that they're working on in the future. So that's an interesting space at the moment in terms of imaging. A little bit more on the sensing side. So our sort of step below are nonlinear optics, in this case, Piplin. We're largely seeing a progression in terms of efficiency. Those efficiencies are a little bit slow moving forward, but they're still moving forward, and that's absolutely fine. And the supply chain is extremely strong. I should sort of point out that Cohesion recently merged and they're doing very, very well. So congratulations to them from a UK perspective. I know some of the colleagues might be on the call today. And more generally, and maybe they're the better people to speak to on this one, the roadmap is quite difficult to predict from a macroscopic sort of view with nonlinear optics. And this is largely because the applications keep sort of coming up from left field. Originally, you could use this in terms of an improvement from telecoms. A lot of people, in terms of sensing, use piplin to convert telecoms lasers to interesting wavelengths of choice. You have OPMs that are used. But we're seeing more and more, there's an interest from quantum comms, from compute in this area, and even as an alternative for more conventional technologies. So nonlinear optics is quite difficult to play out, but broadly speaking, it's doing very healthy. And I'm particularly interested in that area to see what comes forward there. And then finally, in terms of as a technology platform, you have Rydberg sensing. So the image here is of your vapor cells. And this is increasingly of interest, particularly to government procurement suppliers that we've been talking to at the moment. There's a lot of national security applications here, border control, etc., but also medical. And both of those areas are very much your public domain providers. And in a lot of nuance technologies, you see that government first as a customer is a really strong way forward. So we're seeing more and more of a growth in this area. Vapor cells are still quite hard to come by. There are a couple of companies that remain quite dominant here, particularly over on the American side. So there's more of an interest for Europe to be involved there. So if anyone knows of any good vapor cell suppliers, then let me know. I'm sure we'd be certainly interested as a UK market, but broadly speaking, I think a lot of people in Europe would be interested in making more of those on this side of the pond. But also we've seen a lot of the laser companies be quite interested in this space. Anyone who works on the atomic side on sensing will know that lasers are key. Often people have a hell of a lot of lasers when they're working with these, and it's actually the optical side that does a lot in terms of your size, weight, power, and cost requirements. So the influence of NKT, Toptica, so on and so forth is actually quite strong in this market. So it's interesting from a geopolitical kind of standpoint because at the moment you've got the Americas that make the cells predominantly, but Europe is actually very, very strong in terms of its optical input. So you actually have quite a control over this market. And we're seeing more and more of these come to a sort of commercial head, particularly in the healthcare domain. Some good example of those within the UK. So those are some of the interesting developments from a technological standpoint and where they're kind of going at the moment. I'd be really interested if people have any other good examples with these technologies. I know that there's a hell of a lot more, and where your particular firms are going. I suppose as a sort of a plug-in from the UK, we're really interested in promoting these as well. So if anyone has an interest in broadening out in that space, then do let me know. I suppose one other thing that I would really like to talk about as a final sort of subject matter within my talk is where in this development does it mean from a product standpoint? And most people are familiar with sort of technology readiness levels. It's not quite the same, nor is it sort of a manufacturing readiness level. It's kind of where do you sit on your vertical, I suppose, in your market. But generally, we've seen a shift in quantum from these kind of element-based components through to general components, devices, systems, and then ultimately onto platforms. Platforms is not usually actually something that quantum and photonics touches. And by platform, I mean an entire system. And we hope to see a little bit more of that integration. There's a bit of a gap still. So what I mean by that is that, for example, if you are doing a LiDAR-based approach, how do you map onto things which already exist in that industrial environment? Are there any standards or any typically used software that you can interlink with very, very quickly. That interface is still a little murky from the general perspective of the market, but more and more we're starting to see pretty concrete devices and over on to systems themselves. Now, one thing that we're expecting to see when the market matures a bit further is actually the technology to sort of flow back the other way. So this is usually when you have system integrators, which are pretty big markets in themselves, sort of tier one suppliers, become very, very comfortable with devices and components. And they can actually take on those as OEM parts and then build the systems and the platforms themselves. So we haven't quite seen a dramatic sort of shift in that yet. So there's still a bit of growth to expect in the quantum technology markets. But certainly we hope and expect to see that in the sort of horizon of about 5 to 10 years. Not to say that it's not happening at all, but more on a general scale. Most people are still pushing for more and more quantum-based systems. Now, I mentioned in terms of previously about the back and forth with AI and where countries sort of stand. I think one of the key things with this in mind is that I think if you are a firm that is able to produce concrete systems in the sort of the quantum domain, you're going to do really, really well. I'm aware of a couple at the moment, but that skill set has not been particularly strongly advertised in the sort of the quantum space. So if you're thinking as an organization, hang on a minute, I can take a component to a device and a device and stick it in a system and meet an end user need, you're going to do really, really well over the next couple of years in the sort of the quantum and photonic space. Certainly the UK government would be happy to fund you. And that's a lot of where our funding sort of direction is going. I would also say that if there's any sort of learnings or specifications that you think are unrealistic, it's worth sort of putting those into the standard committees at the moment. I know expectations are high at the moment in quantum, and there's a level of management there. But again, it's valuable to have this kind of feedback. And then finally, if there's anything in the sort of the long run, when we expect this kind of flow back to more element and component based, in terms of infrastructure, a lot of countries get quite worried about this because they realize it needs long-term planning. And without sort of devolving into a conversation about semiconductors, having input about what the infrastructure you need to build those elements and components is valuable as well. But at the moment, just to, I suppose, tie off, if you feel you're confident to build system base, you'll do particularly well. And I'd be really interested to hear more about people that can do that. So I suppose to do the epic question, to kind of tie off before I get inundated by questions and complaints about my talk. The thing that would be great for me would be if you have any of, if you've heard anything that I've talked about and you go, actually, I know a fantastic supplier that can do that. Maybe they're based in Europe. Maybe they're not even based in Europe, but they have an interest in the UK. That would be brilliant. We are really in demand for that at the moment. And then in terms of what I can do for EPIC members, my role certainly sits at the interface between sort of academia, industry and government. And government is looking about where it's going to spend its pennies next. In particular, they want to have systems that give confidence to their arm's length bodies, that they can get them into BAU, business as usual, really quickly. We constantly get put forward technologies that say, okay, yes, if you've got a PhD in quantum mechanics or you really know the ins and outs in photonics, you can work with us. But really, they want someone that, a builder, a plumber, a nurse, these types of individuals can interact with, that is a quantum device that gives them a quantum advantage. So if there are any systems like that that you're aware of, that you think a government or a large public body would be interested in, then I'd be happy to hear about that. I think I could probably help you out there. So that's a very sort of whirlwind talk, trying to keep to time there. And hopefully you've got some questions for me. So thanks very much.